Hello, everyone. This is Kyle Matthews from the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're pleased to have another interview for the Coronavirus Diaries, talking about human rights in the age of the global pandemic. Today, we have renowned Canadian journalist Terry Glavin. Terry writes for Maclean's, Post Media. He's also a fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Terry, glad to have you on for this interview.
Well, thanks for having me.
So Terry, I'm going to get right to it. Anyone who follows you on Twitter, they know that you've got a lot to say about human rights, but you've particularly been following the case of China and authoritarianism, so you understand what's at stake. I'd like to talk. You wrote an extremely powerful piece for Maclean's that was released last Friday about how China, it's Xi Jinping's moment, and he's taken advantage of this. I'm wondering if you could just tell us what you see happening. How is China reacting in the propaganda department regarding this current health crisis?
Right. Well, I think for me, I've been working on that particular angle, I think 13 or 14 days, and it was, quite a deep dive from Maclean's, but there's a lot on the cutting room floor, so to speak. And I was focusing in on 5 days in February. And the main events were February 3rd and February 6th. On February 3rd, Xi Jinping met with the Politburo, and the speech was released about a week or two later. And I've seen 2 or 3 translations of the speech, but the main takeaway points were that he'd been running the show since the 7th of January. You may remember that he was sort of in the background. He didn't want any didn't want to be publicly associated with the coronavirus outbreak at all. He'd been running the show since the 7th of January, and the main message he was giving to the party leadership was they should focus on 2 things. The first was what he called, well, there's a number of translations, but essentially it's we have to ensure that China is not isolated. We can't have China isolated from the rest of the world. The importance of its export markets, its export-driven economy, the air lanes have to be kept open at all costs. And the second was a focus on, translates into English as diplomacy propaganda. That's actually quite key. And the number of, it was aimed at both, of course, a domestic audience and a foreign audience. The domestic audience propaganda was hinged to a great extent on kind of third-party confirmation and affirmation. So, they would trot out the World Health Organization, they would trot out the president of Serbia, they would trot out our own foreign minister, Francois-Philippe Champagne, very early on and prominently, and a number of times. And they trot out or make reference to Canada on a number of occasions, making reference to our health minister, Patty Hajdu. And the other thing that was really, really fascinating from my point of view, because I watch propaganda very closely, having spent a lot of time in the Middle East and covered the crucifixion of the Syrian people, the degree to which the Russian disinformation on chemical weapons use by the Assad regime, casting the white helmets as a branch of Al-Qaeda, denying that the regime was even using barrel bombs, the thing that was interesting to me was that China had begun to engage in similar kinds of disinformation, and people who watch this stuff, the Stratcoms people in Europe, NGOs like the Alliance for Securing Democracy had noticed this too, and in a much more sophisticated way than I had. And also ProPublica in the United States, which is an investigative journalists consortium. It's not like they haven't done this before exactly, the people in the Obama administration that first noticed what the Russians were doing in the 2016 American presidential election 2 years ago pointed out that they had seen China start to do this stuff too in Australia. And the whole point of this kind of what we call Russian style disinformation is not so much to, to simply tell lies and enforce a particular narrative, right? It's not either or, but it's not just, there are no concentration camps in Xinjiang. It becomes, well, there are re-education camps in Xinjiang. There are vocational training centers in Xinjiang. So, China had done this before to some extent, and they also had the capacity to do it. They developed the public information department, the organization department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party had developed a capacity to do this sort of thing, and it was very noticeable in Hong Kong in the summer of 2019, last summer. There was sort of army of people on social media, on WeChat, on Weibo, and noticeably on Twitter, which of course is aimed outward because it's blocked in China. Mm-hmm. So they had the means. And everything starts to mobilize after that February 3rd speech, and any number of the most absurd conspiracy theories were being circulated. The whole point of disinformation, sort of Russian-style disinformation, is to throw you off balance. Is to, RT News is a classic example of this. We're quite familiar with it because it's an English language effort. Is that it has all the appearance of a professional news organization, and they will indeed report news. But what they do is they throw in the most absurd, sort of experts from the West to cast doubt on what is so routinely described as the official narrative. And of course, we're all schmucks if we simply agree with the official narrative of 9/11 and so on. It just sort of throws everybody off balance, right? And so the whole point of that, and Russia, by the way, ramped up like crazy after the coronavirus, directing disinformation of that kind at European audiences. This was very well documented by the European Union and its foreign policy arm, and they have a very dedicated team that looks at disinformation and the implications. And another really interesting thing was that in this strange ecosystem, there was this sort of, I don't know if it's cross-pollination or, genetic transfer between species of disinformation, but it was Iranian, Russian, and Chinese, and of course I'm referring to the regimes, amplification of one another's conspiracy theories and so on. Iran was, everybody laughs at Iranian media. They were Zionist agents, and the coronavirus was engineered in a lab in such a way as to seek out the Iranian gene. Just hilarious stuff. But melding that with Russian stuff, and also fringe third-party websites. The most noticeable and hilarious in Canada, and they threatened to sue me once years ago, was the Center for Research on Globalization, which is centered in Montreal, or it's one guy, a bunch of weird.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because, I know that group, the most fringe theorists, they're all kind of neo-Marxists. The Backman Bureau, we organize events in Montreal with the interim Venezuelan ambassador to Canada, and we had all those groups show up at my office and try to.
I remember that. Yes.
So
Erwin Kotler, was it Erwin Kotler? One of those, yeah.
Well, one of those other things with Erwin Kotler where they also disrupted, but it's a small circle of people that they're conspiracy theorists, and the fact that as you mentioned, that the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry is citing this website as proof of some U.S. involvement or the U.S. Army in planting this in Wuhan in October is so far-fetched.
Yeah, it's quite. The South China Morning Post yesterday had an absolute. It was almost like genome sequencing, looking at the viral disinformation of that particular period that involved the Center for Research on Globalization, and engaging in an entire sort of forensic reconstruction of how that deception was carried out, because it looks so convincing, right?
Yeah.
If you're not careful, if you just sort of take these people for granted, they seem to have proper anti-imperialist credentials, and the sort of the weaponization of information, a lot of it, it seems to me, our susceptibility of it is something that I think we should be paying closer attention to. Why have we become so vulnerable to what you might call fake news or disinformation, Trumpism? I mean, how is it that the broad left, if you like, in the United States found itself so ill-equipped to deal with the fact that Donald Trump, and I don't want to be partisan and mean about this, and it's very fashionable, and you can get away with saying anything about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But objectively, I think, because I sort of think of myself as a person of the left, very generally speaking, and it seems to me that there was after 9/11. There was, a general disorientation across the political spectrum. It was like everybody suffered a blunt trauma wound to the head. Everybody went a little bit crazy. The American culture particularly was not constitutionally, culturally, politically prepared for something like this. And it also occurred at a time when technology had changed really, really, really rapidly, so that a couple of kids in a garage in Chicago could produce what, until very, very recently, would look like a CBS 60 Minutes documentary, and had all kinds of visuals to support, crazy ideas about 9/11 and the planes going into the building. And the technology was, everybody had cell phone cameras or digital cameras of one sort or another. So there's hundreds of hours of footage that you could manipulate and in such a way as to support crazy and wicked and very, very sinister and dangerous ideas. And unfortunately, at the time, in the universities, and it kind of seeped out from the universities across the left, is this sort of problematization of the truth, and a descent into epistemic relativism. The truth claims no longer sort of require objective evidence and empirical evidence and testing, but they're very, very subjective. That the veracity, the privilege that we accord various truth claims are unmoored from the conventional, even Marxist assessment of their veracity and viability. Right?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. It's the emotion matters more than what evidence is suggesting. But Terry,
the identity stuff too works into that, unfortunately. And I mean, I should like to think my anti-racist credentials will stand up against anyone's, but we've had a real difficulty with this on the issue of dealing with China. The conflation of Chinese ethnicity and the interests of the Chinese diaspora in Western countries with the regime in Beijing.
Yeah.
And this can be manipulated in ways that suit the purposes of the racist right. And if you have to be very, very careful, I think, to weed out a lot of stuff that presents itself as anti-racist, but is actually quite sinister and deceptive. The Chinese government does that a lot. You might remember where, the Chinese ambassador Liu She, the former ambassador, characterizing Canada's concern about the kidnapping of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor as white supremacy.
I remember following that, and it was but you see how the Chinese, at least diplomats, are looking at discussions in Canada currently, the polarization of the left and the right, identity politics, and they're using that against us. And any criticism of you see of the Chinese response or any culpability for the spread of the coronavirus to a global pandemic is now being used the same way, that, oh, let's just collaborate together, you're being racist, don't condemn the Chinese people. I mean, it really is, they're using this, authoritarian states are using this to create more division in Western societies.
Yeah, and I mean, this has been going on for a while. This isn't something that just started February 3rd. I remember 10 years ago, it's been kind of lonely when you cover this kind of stuff as a journalist in Canada. It's not now, though, which is great. I used to worry about getting scooped, because most journalists do. I don't worry about that anymore. It's great. It means somebody else is writing this stuff, right? But about 10 years ago, when the Harper government was being badgered to approve the what was it, the 15.1 billion, I think it was, takeover of Nexen by the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, CNOC. And the Chinese state-owned enterprises they were buying up strategic spigot points in the oil patch in Alberta. And a lot of people in the Conservative Party were concerned about this. And cabinet was split. And at the time, just writing about this stuff, just noticing it, and you'd be called xenophobic. And then this has really seriously enfeebled and infantilized the public debates about Chinese capital and its impact on the real estate industry in Vancouver. Vancouver is, from year to year, is in the top 3 of the least affordable cities on earth. And the Chinese elites, the princeling caste, if you like, and a lot of white people in the real estate industry would trot this stuff out. It's xenophobic and xenophobic to be concerned about the immigrant investor program or whatever. And the interesting thing about that is, because I grew up out here, and most of my sort of interlocutors and collaborators on these issues happen to be Chinese. And the most effective and intelligent activists in Vancouver on the real estate issue, their first language was Cantonese, even if, they might have been 2nd or 3rd generation Canadians. But, they were the ones who were saying, hey, wait a minute, are you kidding me? I mean, are you calling me a racist? So it was, it's become difficult for this kind of bullying and disinformation to succeed. It still happens. I see it all the time, and it's particularly dismaying when I see my own government, my own prime minister, the health minister, the foreign minister engage in the same thing. We must be careful not to stigmatize people.
Well, Terry, let's talk about this, because that is, at the early on of this crisis, there were a lot of calls that maybe we should follow the Americans, close flights to China. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't do it, and now I'm in Montreal, and this is now center point for all this. Like, we have the highest number of COVID cases. Our human rights have been hurt. The movement, people are losing their jobs. It's serious, but you've talked about how the government has not been that forceful, not strategic. I want to get back to the Canadian government. Last week, you saw the health minister. Journalists were asking her, do you believe in the official stats of deaths and number of infected cases in China? And the health minister responded, basically taking the Chinese position and basically calling it conspiracy theory. And at the same time, should we question Chinese data? I think we should, because it's a closed state. They don't always tell the truth. What's your take on all of this?
I really lament Okay, look, there's a couple of things going on here. This is we're in a state of emergency, okay? Call it a public health crisis. This isn't the measles. We have seen, this is like nothing we've seen since the Second World War. And public trust in our institutions, particularly when the mobilization against the enemy, to use unhelpful warfare metaphor, requires such vast social commitment, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about us. It's, the government can't do much except source personal protective equipment for the hospitals. At this point, it depends on a major public consensus that we all have to sacrifice, make serious sacrifices to get through this. And at a time like this, public trust in our institutions is absolutely, it's win or lose. Everything will fall apart unless we do have that deep trust in our government institutions. So I've been kind of holding back, watching this unfold. But after last Thursday, I guess it was, when a reporter asked, okay, you got the American intelligence community and the CIA saying, we really shouldn't trust Chinese government figures about infection rates and so on. And this arrogant and outburst, and paradoxically referring to conspiracy theories. Are you kidding me? China is the main source of conspiracy theories at the moment on this issue. There's a number of times when I really wanted to knock one out of the park over the last 3 weeks, and I just haven't. Because, there are a couple of things. If you look at the data, the social sciences data in the United States, polling data, the gulf, the spread, the gap between Americans who take this seriously and Americans who don't, in red states, blue states, right across the board, age groups, urban centers, everywhere, is widening, right? Yeah. So it's like the American system, the American political culture is kind of broken. And the last thing we want to do is see that phenomenon take root in Canada. So, I have been holding back, but I regret to say that, and I'm not at the end of this, very, very soon, in fact, now, we should all be calling the government on its tragic and catastrophic error in believing the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization takes its data from the Chinese government and gives it to the rest of the world. And by the time 80 countries around the world had finally said, you know what, we all know this is a bit of a fiction, and we better not, we better do something about it, had progressively, dealt with flight restrictions by the time Canada caught up. Canada only caught up. Canada actually didn't impose any flight restrictions on the centers like Iran and China. Canada just, sort of did this sort of blanket ban. You remember that? Yeah. No foreigners should come to Canada except for the Americans, and that's kind of complicated. At every hand's turn, I'd like to think there's a defense that we could make of the World Health Organization leadership and Tedros, in that they could not actually get into China. They were held up for weeks, I think 2.5 weeks, before a WHO team could even get into China. 25 people on the team. There were supposed to be 12 Americans. No, the Americans weren't allowed in. The American Center for Disease Control wanted to get in. They couldn't. And so, a case can be made that the Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, has been telling us telling a good lie, right? Lying to us in order to get into China and get information from China. But that, that defense actually doesn't hold up very, very well. The disinformation and misinformation that came out of China from the very beginning, suppression of data, the very day when Patty Hadju said, "Oh, you know, there's no reason to think that China is misreporting or underreporting data." Okay, 4 days earlier, Wang Yi, the Chinese premier, or Li Keqiang, had, after riots in China, and you know, in most other countries of the world, you know, the disgrace and shame of having admitted to underreporting, finally said, "Okay, we're going to start counting and you know, asymptomatic cases," right? Because they weren't counting asymptomatic cases. The South China Morning Post got data that showed that rather than 82,000 infections in Wuhan, Hubei, and environs, it was more like 125,000. That's massive underreporting. The Chinese government had already admitted, and they had all these interesting excuses and justifications for not counting asymptomatic infections, positive tests. But they've admitted to their own underreporting. Editor of the China Daily, which is directly owned by the publicity department, the propaganda department of the Communist Party of China, praising Patty Hadju, our own health minister, as a role model, okay, and criticizing Canadian journalists for these questions, you know, as mischief makers and paparazzi. This doesn't look good, and you know, you'd have to be, you know, one of these slightly deranged Trudeau partisans to fail to see something amiss in this. And you know, this is the thing, is that what I started to do, because I didn't want to get into the politics of it, and I'm not a science degree holder, so it's hard for me. It takes a while for me to walk through this stuff. But the Massachusetts Institute of Technology first pointed us to this. It's an aggregation database where public labs in countries all over the world, including China, you know, everybody sends their information about the genomic sequence of each tested case of an infection. And you know, it goes into a central database, and you can trace the family tree of you know, so I think at the time, about a week ago, it was about 4 or 5 distinct family trees of the virus in each of these cases of infection. And you can actually trace that tree back. And you can see, you know, they've done it very interestingly and visually in a time-space data series that, okay, this is how it got to Montreal. Yeah. This is how it got to BC and when. And you look at that data, and it was all flights coming into Canada.
Yeah.
It was all flights coming into Canada when we were saying, you know, no, don't worry about flights coming into Canada, right? And it was, I guess, 2 weeks ago, until 2 weeks ago, 80%, 76% of the infections in Canada were travelers. 4%, so 80% altogether were like immediate contact with a traveler. And it's only, I think, on Tuesday of this past week that community transmission has caught up to travelers, right? So, I mean, it's hard to say, to be fair, you know, when you look at the way exponentials work in predictive analytics, you can't say, well, if we shut down the border, we wouldn't have this problem. I mean, that's obvious. Mm-hmm. But you can't, you know, you'd have to sort of engage in a kind of retroactive clairvoyance to be able to say this is how much of a difference it made. But the reality is it made all the difference in the early going when our health, when the World Health Organization was saying it makes no difference, and when our government was saying closing the borders makes no difference. Now, here's the thing. The second half of Xi Jinping's sort of order on February 3rd, we can't allow the airlanes to be closed. We can't allow China to be isolated. We have to keep the doors open, open door, right? That's what that was all about.
Oh, I agree with
No
you.
public health advantage to us at all. It was to provide an economic advantage to Xi Jinping. That's why the flights were kept open.
So just Terry, so there's ultimate failures here, and I think there's a lot of blame to go around. My concern is that you mentioned that what we're seeing is unlike anything we've seen since World War II, or unlike anything we ever come across. That we're making enormous sacrifices. Our economy is in a tailspin. This is going to be a long-term structural challenge for our country, and people are going to start getting angry. They usually
Yes.
do. So the part of the Chinese propaganda is deflect any blame of China having any responsibility for this, trying to push on the Americans. And then we have a lack of trust in the United Nations, which is growing by the day. And then a growing concern about the decisions made by our government on this. I mean, we've got a perfect cocktail of mistrust in multilateral institutions and our own government. How do you see this playing out? I mean, do you have a crystal ball, or how do you see?
Yeah, good one. One thing I've tried to sort of say in the backgrounders and the sort of analyses that, I mean, that's sort of my job that I'm doing for Maclean's and the National Post and the Ottawa Citizen, is who the hell knows, basically. I mean, like, I was with my buddy the other day, I was joking, like, for all we know, because of the way, all of these unanticipated things and all of the just countless variables that you have to factor into, the modeling. For all I know, you know what? A month from now, this might all be behind us. There might be some super vaccine that some whiz kid in Palo Alto develops, and it's easily diffused, and you just take a pill and everything's fine. Or it's like some zombie movie. And I'm up in the hills with my rifle shooting grouse to stay alive, and I don't know. I mean, that's the difficulty with this. So I think the only thing that I think we can do, like most Canadians, most ordinary citizens, trust your provincial governments. Maybe we should be paying less attention to Ottawa, even though, my focus, my job is sort of, international affairs, foreign policy, and all that kind of stuff. In a time like this, how are our provincial governments doing, right? And what are they doing? And let's look at the division of labor between the provinces and the federal government. And you look at that, and we're actually, you've got a really interesting and very heartening thing happening when you've got an NDP government in British Columbia, John Horgan's the premier, and you've got Rob Ford. Is it Rob Ford? I always mix up with Ford brothers.
It's Doug Ford.
Doug Ford, premier of Ontario. And sort of populist right-wing guy and a old-fashioned working class proletarian left-wing guy, and they're talking the same language, and they're being nice to one another, and everybody's kind of figuring it out. And I think that's heartening to me. So looking at the future, if those kinds of social values, social goods are still with us, I think we're going to be okay. It's going to be brutal, but in terms of the bigger picture, not just the long term anymore, but like the immediate, like right now, Xi Jinping is making his move. Made in China 2025, and then the 2050 thing. Reshaping the world order in the image and likeness of the Chinese Communist Party, displacing the United States and the European Union as the sort of model for globalization, capturing key global supply chains, which we've already seen in medical equipment.
Yeah.
And also in information technology. They're already making their move. Huawei, by the way, is central to this. Huawei and two other state-owned telecoms in China and the Ministry of Information and Industrial Technology in China will be going to the International Typographical Telecommunications Union in November. The ITU is one of 15 UN agencies, and China already controls 4 of them directly. They control the World Health Organization indirectly. They're going to the UN in November with a plan to essentially take over the architecture of the entire global internet. They are putting all of this in hyperdrive, right? And they've seen the future, and they're back up and running. You know, the economic data from China is always, we're always right to question it, but all of the evidence, or at least there's no counter evidence to the claims that the Chinese government is making with respect to the resumption of economic production. Even in Wuhan, the epicenter, and Hubei, they're 75 to 95% up and running again. They're going. Meanwhile, the rest of us are in deep freeze. We're in, we're on life support. So
Terry, I want to ask you one last question. Let you get back to your pleasant Sunday of self-isolation. So the narrative is emerging that China, bungled this at the start, hid information so that it wouldn't impact the party, and now it's spread to the world. We're all on lockdown, and China's at the same time making these moves to take advantage of the situation to come ahead. I foresee, or I imagine, there could be some, a growing anti-China backlash, particularly anger, not at China people of Chinese ethnicity, but at the Chinese government. And I'm starting to see politicians in Africa, Asia asking for reparations. Do you see this as something that could challenge the Communist Party of China with their grand objectives? That this could lead to a major backlash?
Definitely. And I think, you see, the Politburo is, and has been from the very beginning, acutely aware of this possibility. And everything that they do has been, geared to dealing with that, right? The reliable partner propaganda, that's actually a term that keeps showing up, and people who, I can talk trash about Donald Trump as well as anybody, but you start to see people referring to China as a more reliable partner than Donald Trump, all this kind of stuff. In Europe particularly, and it's the right-wing parties, the populist parties, that have begun to push this. The Italian far right, the Serbs, the Hungarians, China's great, screw NATO, screw the European Union, China's got our back. In the liberal democracies, things are actually not as clear, because we have a very strange disconnect, particularly in Canada, where, for instance, Pew Global Attitude Survey, magnificent project that they've been running for years in a number of sectors. I think December, and I believe it was 20-something, 27-something countries, I may be wrong, looking at public attitudes about the Chinese government, like, what do you think about these people? And Canadians were right up there with, I think, the Swedes and the Japanese, top 3, in having a low opinion, a really, really low opinion of the Chinese government. And yet, the government of Canada is almost unique, certainly in the G7, probably in the G20, in the way we suck up to China. There's a real, and this is not, this is objectively true. It's just unimpeachable. I don't mean to be mean, and I don't mean to be partisan, but it's just true at any number of levels. So you've got that kind of backlash that goes up and down in the opinion polls, and it's certainly going way up now. What that will mean to the Canadian government, what it's going to take to shift a government that still has taken no retaliatory measures or protective measures, since December 2018, when they kidnapped 2 of our people in a direct, retaliation for merely acting on a U.S. extradition request. I mean, Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, she's free to leave Canada anytime she wants. She's hiding here. The Chinese are using this wedge between Canada and the United States because people don't like Donald Trump. A lot of people think, well, anything Trump says about the Chinese, when he talks trash about the Chinese, he must be lying. And every time somebody says something, well, at least the Chinese are sending in all of these plane loads of gear. They're better than Donald Trump. You're right. We're heading to a moment of profound disorientation. And one can only hope that we kind of keep our heads through this, give our heads a shake, and perhaps not be quite so willing to engage in partisan, the weaponization of information and so on. Inshallah, there will be a reckoning.
Well, Terry, with that inshallah comment, I think that's the perfect way to end this talk. There's going to be a lot to see. I look forward to seeing what you're writing in the next few weeks about this, and let's stay in touch.
Okay, I hope I was helpful in some way.
Thanks, Terry.